So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fifth episode of our speaker series, Unlocking the Potential of Diversified Farming, Exploring Benefits and Overcoming Barriers. My name is Carly McGregor, and I am a lab manager at the Plant Insect Ecology and Evolution Lab, led by Dr. Julie Carrillo and LFS here at UBC, where we investigate how farmland diversification practices can improve the sustainability of crop production through biodiversity conservation, among several other research areas that pertain to plants and insects more broadly. Before this role, I obtained my MSc in Dr. Claire Kremen's lab at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability here at UBC, where I studied how farmland diversification supports wild pollinators in the lower mainland of BC. So as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that UBC Vancouver's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Our lives are tied to the land in so many more ways than we might imagine. The land is our playground, it's our school, it's our dining table, and it's our home. And as we gather virtually today, with many of us currently on Indigenous lands, and as we talk about managing farmland, which also largely sits on Indigenous lands, I encourage everyone to think about the honor and accountability that we hold to the land's original caretakers. I'm grateful to be learning on Musqueam land today, and I hope that we will continue to collectively amplify Indigenous values and voices. If you'd like to find out more about whose territories you're on, check out nativeland.ca. So thank you for joining us today for the fifth installment of Food at the Tipping Point, Ways Forward from a Food System in Crisis. From past themes of resiliency to innovation and now to action, this year's speaker series focuses on the urgency to act. With extinction level biodiversity losses, more frequent and severe extreme weather events impacting all stages of the food system, rising food insecurity, and growing political tensions, a widespread and dramatic change is urgently needed. So you can join us every other Thursday, where we bring together community leaders, researchers, and on-the-ground experts for inspiration and real solutions. Excuse me, this series is presented by the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the UBC Farm, generously sponsored by RBC Royal Bank, and is hosted in partnership with the UBC Faculty of Land and Food Systems and the BC Food Web. The Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC Farm is a teaching and research center, as well as a local to global food hub, working towards a more sustainable, food secure future. BC Food Web is a web portal project which aims to increase access and connection to current research and other resource materials. And the Faculty of Land and Food Systems is a world leader in research and teaching about a sustainable and healthy food supply. So today's topic is unlocking the potential of diversified farming, exploring the benefits and overcoming barriers. And this webinar was convened by Jenna Melanson, a PhD candidate in UBC's Working to Restore Connectivity and Sustainability Lab. And we are excited to welcome Kenzo Esquivel, Lydia Ryle, Kevin North, and Kevin Cusson with us today, providing a nuanced look into the benefits of diversification, the challenges that farmers face, and the actions and policies that can be implemented to reduce barriers. So just for some general housekeeping, after each panelist gives a brief presentation, we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please navigate to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel and share those with us. Also, feel free to upvote others' questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol next to that question. Speaking first today is Kenzo Esquivel. So Kenzo is a fourth-year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. He works in the Berkeley agroecology lab, investigating the policy, supply chain, and economic constraints facing the adoption of diversified farming practices, and the impact that these practices have on soil health and function. He obtained his MS in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Michigan and BS in Environmental and Geophysical Science from the University of Chicago. So Kenzo will be presenting some recent work done by him and his team in the Central Coast of California, investigating the barriers that organic farmers face in adopting various diversification practices. So take it away, Kenzo.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Like was said, my name is Kenzo. Thank you so much to the event organizers for convening this awesome panel today. Really excited to share some of my work and also hear from the other panelists. Can I confirm audio is good, slide is good? Great. Okay. So I'm going to dive in. I will say I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. I did my best to distill some key outcomes from 2 recent papers that are coming out of a series of interviews done with organic farmers in California. And so I'm going to go ahead and just dive in. First, I really want to acknowledge that this has been a really awesome big team collaboration, including Dr. Claire Kremen, who's now up at UBC, and a huge team of both social scientists and natural and physical scientists. And I feel like that's really a critical component of this research project in trying to understand how we move towards a more sustainable food system, is that it's going to take everyone, it's going to take a village and all the unique skill sets that we all bring. And so really quickly want to acknowledge that huge team. So to kind of contextualize some of the work that I'll be presenting today, it's all been done in the California Central Coast. This is the region kind of spanning everywhere south of the San Francisco Bay Area, largely down almost to LA. And this area is a super highly productive area. It's often called the salad bowl of the US. And our specific study sites include parts of Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Benito counties. In Monterey County alone, there's many hundreds of millions of dollars in just these 3 primary crops, strawberries, leaf lettuce, and head lettuce. And so in addition to that, some cold season crops like brassicas and broccoli are some key crops in this area. But some pretty critical environmental and land use and policy challenges loom. Obviously, there's climate change, but in this specific region, there's also newly some sustainable groundwater management actions happening and concerns with nitrate pollution in our watershed. And so there's quite a few overlapping different things that I won't quite touch on today, but just to say that there's a lot going on in this region. This region is also really closely nestled to Santa Cruz and was really a hotspot in kind of when organic production really started to take off, both given its kind of specific local history and proximity to places like UC Santa Cruz and kind of some of the original academics thinking about agroecology as a concept. You might think that the system has maybe higher use of these so-called diversification practices. I also might call them soil health practices, regenerative practices. There are a lot of kind of different names, and I'll get a little bit more specific in a bit. But some recent work using remote sensing data from our group found that only about 6% of farmland in this area had winter cover crops. The majority, 60%, were bare over the winter. And this was stuff that we kind of knew anecdotally, that a lot of farmers were having a hard time figuring out if and how and when to integrate things like cover crops, reduced tillage. But this remote sensing data has kind of validated just kind of the sparseness, even in this region, of cover cropping. And we know that nationally, these levels are even lower. And so part of the question that we had going into this project was, what are and how do like the socioeconomic constraints and policy levers influence agricultural management decision-making on particularly organic farms? So this is a region where organic production is quite a bit higher, again, than like the national level. But even still, we knew that some of these practices were not super readily used. And so the other kind of component of this project was really thinking about, once these practices are implemented, what are these different ecosystem level benefits and farm level benefits that folks are seeing, ranging from things like crop productivity, obviously, but then also things that might be realized on the broader landscape, like carbon storage, closing nutrient cycles, and really looking into nitrogen supply and retention in the soils. Drought has been a huge problem in California, so thinking about water provisioning and kind of how soil health, increasing soil organic matter, can help capture and store some of the scarce water resources that we have here in California. And so for this particular study, we kind of were using some of the core soil health principles as defined by the US Natural Resources kind of agency. And we were looking at specifically cover cropping, like I already mentioned. We were also looking at crop diversity, both kind of in a given season, but then also rotational diversity, disturbance as kind of tillage and kind of looking into reduced tillage practices, as well as kind of the different types of organic amendments that farmers were using. And I won't go through all of these, but these were some of the variables that we were collecting through in-depth surveys from our participating farmers to kind of get a sense of how widely adopted these different practices were. And across the 28 participating farm sites that we had, this is kind of like an overwhelming graphic, but the main point here is each of these lines represents kind of the overall utilization of a subset of these practices, and higher up scores mean that they've used them more, and lower scores mean they've used them less. And kind of the key thing here is that even amongst organic producers in this fairly like narrow geographic region, we saw a huge spread of the adoption of these different practices. And for some farms, maybe they're adopting all of them, some barely any of them, but then quite a few of them also implemented a mix. And so it's a quite complex picture, and it's not necessarily straightforward how exactly these practices are being rolled out and how they're being implemented. And so we followed up and kind of talked to 20 growers on the Central Coast. All of them grew lettuce. And it was a pretty intentional sample size also, in that we wanted to have some fairly large scale producers, some small scale producers. And we also talked to folks who are providing technical assistance through extension agencies, some like smaller, just like nonprofit agencies that do kind of this type of farmer outreach. And from these interviews, as we started to kind of go through them and try to understand the patterns there, we started to kind of notice a pattern of 3 major groupings of our farms. And one thing that I want to note here is that we didn't really use scale as one of the key defining factors for these 3 different groupings. Rather, scale kind of emerged out of the data as we looked to try to understand how and why farmers were adopting soil health practices. So I'm going to walk through these 3 categories really briefly. The first one we were calling our limited resource farmers. These were the folks generally operating on the smallest parcels of land. They experienced extremely high economic pressures, largely out of kind of insecure access to land and continual income. They largely had short land tenure by necessity, and really didn't have the flexibility or the resources to implement a lot of these soil health practices that we talked about. Some illustrative quotes here, like, we would love to have it all covered, but we don't have the money to, right? Or like, if you're going to be leasing, you're not going to plant perennials. And so talking about kind of how short-term land tenure really impacts kind of the types of decision farmers are making in terms of things like perennials, which are long-term investments, right? And we know from the data that regenerating soil and investing in soil is a long-term process. And so it doesn't make economic sense for these short-term leases to really necessarily invest in these types of practices. On the flip end, we had what we're calling these large wholesale farmers that were largely selling into kind of bigger markets. These folks also faced acute economic pressure, but in a fairly different way, where they were operating on fairly big money, slim margins, and relatively high risk. These folks also had short land tenure, but this was often more by choice, and so allowed them the flexibility to kind of adjust their acreage depending on market demand. And the biggest drivers of their farming model was economic as well, but it wasn't so much limited resources, but rather constraints imposed by the supply chain and the buyers that they sell to. So some major things that came up in these growers was lack of flexibility in cropping system and planting schedules. When buyers are expecting X number of crates of lettuce, makes it harder to kind of play around and practice things like cover cropping. Additionally, food safety concerns are a big thing in this region, especially with leafy greens. And so after kind of some recent, semi-recent, I guess, early aughts, E. coli outbreaks and things like spinach, a lot of leafy green grower or buyers started to crack down on things that they thought might be point sources for foodborne diseases and pathogens, and that included limiting the types of compost and animal integration that could happen on farms, as well as limiting riparian buffers and hedgerows. And so a lot of these had to get out. And one of these quotes here, what used to be a windbreak is now a hazard. And so that was one quote about some hedgerows. We're pretty much forced to abide by the rules that are given to us by our buyers. And so they have really limited flexibility in kind of contesting the types of rules that are put onto them by the folks that they sell to. Lastly, we had this kind of mid-scale diversified farm that had a fairly different both approach and kind of landscape that they were operating in, where they had quite a lot of different options in terms of the markets they sold into. Some are doing CSAs, selling to local markets, grocery stores, farmers markets, which gave them some financial buffer. And oftentimes these are folks who were able to negotiate longer term leases or actually own their land. And so they have that long, secure land tenure. And in talking to these folks about kind of how they think about soil health practices, it was really clear that they had a more ecological mindset where because of the importance of thinking of farming systems and also availability of resources and long-term tenure, we're really able to invest in soil health practices in a way that we didn't see in the other groups. And so just one illustrative quote here: when you're marketing the way that we do to have a diversity of crops to market is a big benefit. If you have a price you can send out with 20 items, it's much easier for a store to make an order. And so just kind of uplifting also the benefit of having a highly diverse set of crops on a given operation. So kind of the main outcome of this work was really just that there's not going to be ever a one-size-fits-all policy solution if, as policymakers and kind of the general public and academics, we want to see increased adoption of these types of practices. The types of constraints that both the resource limited and the large-scale wholesale farmers are experiencing are completely different and require different types of interventions at different levels. And what might be like a valuable financial incentive for a resource limited farmer is probably going to be pretty meaningless to a large scale wholesale grower. And for these large scale wholesale growers, really helping them navigate kind of food safety requirements is going to be a critical intervention point moving forward. And then finally, for these mid-scale farms, looking to them as useful models about what works in their ecosystems, not necessarily urging large-scale growers to downscale or resource-limited farmers to try to upscale, but really thinking about kind of the successes that these mid-scale farms are able to achieve. So I'm coming up on time here, but I had, I think, just a really quick thing that I want to highlight, that a lot of these barriers are not new necessarily in this region. And so we had a companion paper that really tried to understand the different intervention points that might be possible. Supporting farm level innovation. We know farmers are incredibly creative, and supporting that type of innovation at the farm level, we think is really critical, but puts the onus on farmers. And so thinking about things at the technical policy level, ways that we can get creative in our local policies to, for example, in this region, we're newly recognizing cover cropping as an effective way to reduce nitrate pollution. And so we've been able to incorporate that into some policy measures recently, which is exciting. And then also contending with the biggest level structural barriers like access to land and funding is going to be huge. And we need to be tackling these things kind of all at the same time, which I know is overwhelming, but we really see these as tied together. In the US, we have a farm bill, omnibus. It's a big year for us, and also internationally isn't a big deal. And so be on the lookout for that. And so with that, I want to wrap up. These challenges are complex. We need to be supporting farms and farmers in all different ways, and we need to be tackling things at all sorts of different levels. And so it will truly take a village, and excited to hear about questions and other panelists. Thanks.
Amazing. Thanks, Kenzo. That was a great talk. It's really interesting to see your research. It's really cool to see all those different barriers kind of laid out and those differences between farm scale. So our next speaker is Lydia Ryle. Lydia is the owner of Cropthorne Farm, a 24-acre certified organic vegetable farm on the Fraser Delta. Lydia obtained her BSc in agriculture out on the prairies and returned to her hometown in 2009 to start her own farm. She is also a mom of two, partner to a wildlife biologist, and has just taken up curling. We're grateful to have Lydia here today to share with us her firsthand experience as a farmer. So take it away, Lydia.
Thanks. Let's see if I can share here. It was not happy with me for a second. Let's see. Oh gosh, sorry everybody, obviously. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? Good, thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, so we farm on the Fraser Delta here. I always love this photo. It really shows a great view of the Fraser River. So our farm is on Westham Island, which is just south of Vancouver there. Yeah, thanks, Kenzo. I really enjoyed that. I think you hit a lot of, I think a lot of the issues are really similar to farmers in this area. So yeah, for us at Cropthorne, one of our main philosophies is diversity, biodiversity included. So diversity in our staff, diversity in our crops, like we grow over 40 different crops. And then in the crops that we grow, we have a ton of varieties. So we grow over 20 different radicchio varieties, for example. So, farmers or customers definitely seek out farms like ours looking for the unique varieties that market farms grow. And then we have diversity in our income. So we're doing CSAs, farmers markets, farm stand, restaurants. So we have a really large quite a diverse income stream. And then we also have diversity in our seasons. We grow year round. There's only 1 week of the year that we are not growing. So or that we're not harvesting per se at the end of December. Other than that, we are harvesting every other week of the year. So yeah, and we're really, being a diverse operation, we don't have the ability to do crop insurance. It's not possible on the smaller scale, but what we find when we grow, like the beauty of the diversity is when we grow so many different crops, when one crop falters, it's a banner year for another crop. So the question of like, what do we do to increase biodiversity? First, we have the ability to do it. As I said, we grow 12 months of the year, and we've been farming for 15 years. So there's profitability there, and that is really key for some of these things. So we can afford to put land into hedgerows. We can put money into cover crops, and crops that are not necessarily providing us income. So this is an oat cover crop I have here. And then again, we have a grassland set aside. So we have bees foraging there. So another really important key, I mentioned like diversity is one of our philosophies here at Cropthorne, but another one is the fact that we don't necessarily want to be a human-centric farm. Humans are only one organism that uses the farm. So questioning, our value worth, is it any greater than an earthworm or a snow goose or vole that also, calls this place home? So I feel like we have a duty to accommodate. Of course, it's not perfect. There's always going to be conflict. We have rodent traps in our high tunnels to make sure that they're not eating the crops. We have yet to find a way to do zero till. So earthworms are split in two on occasion. So, we try to have a lot of annual cover crops to give the soil a break, because we can't find a way to reduce tillage in the vegetable system. And of course, the soil's teeming with life. Life that I honestly have no idea about. I don't even know how to conceptualize it, but knowing that it is this magical life-giving force that soil is. So like for me as a business owner, like that's where, kind of some of the philosophy is. This is one of our kids, Gus. So we have a grassland set aside. Sorry, it's not a grassland set aside. This was an annual cover crop, but like lots of pollinators in here. So we have Phacelia and sunflowers along with Sudan grass, and there's clover that you can't really see in there. But yeah, a really nice biodiverse cover crop there. And this is my partner, David, as you can see in the background, keeps walking in during this presentation, but he's a wildlife biologist, and we found this owl actually who was injured. So, we have other, animals that visit the farm. So right now the snow geese are going to be heading up to Wrangel Island in Russia. So they're just finishing their final feeds here. We're planting cover crops for the waterfowl, and then of course for nutrients for us. We also have pollination is really important. We grow pumpkins, so we need the pollination, but obviously pollinators are really important. So we make sure that we are having hedgerows and just having these beauty trees, and they're just buzzing in the springtime when they're flowering. And again, you can see on that sunflower, there's three bees on there. So for us, it is a benefit to us farmers as well. As I said, we're pollinating. But of course, it's great for the wildlife. See if I can get this to go here. So this is a grassland set aside, and you can kind of see going back and forth. There's barn swallows. So they are an endangered species that visit us in the spring to late summer. So having these grassland set-asides provide habitat. Again, we have owls and raptors as well. And this field here the raptors will be flying over and hunting. So we try to find a lot of ways to enhance the farm. And another photo of cover crop. And we let crops go to seed. So this is cilantro, and it's just amazing all the pollinators that will be on here and beneficial insects that if we're not going to be harvesting it, we let it go to flower and use it as a kind of a insectary area. Obstacles. There's definitely a lot. I know mentioned kind of organic certification and food safety for smaller growers, and for us, that isn't one. A lot of things are online these days. It's really easy to do admin, and traceability is needed. Food safety is imperative to our business. We're in the business of making good, healthy food, and we can't make people sick. It can't be part of our business plan. So those things are not necessarily barriers. I think the biggest barrier is, I think a barrier is supply chain. Small diverse farms were not necessarily competitive. We need to direct market. We need to capture that full dollar or the majority of that dollar. So there's a huge time labor cost involved of doing farmers markets for 10 to 12 hours a day. CSAs, there's admin time, reconciling payments, doing newsletters, farm tours, and things like that. So it's a lot of labor that we end up spending on the direct marketing side of things. So I think for me, though, the biggest obstacle with the size of our farms and to, I guess, increase biodiversity and things like that, I think one is lack of skilled labor. It's huge. What farmers do in a day is amazing, and what farm crews do in a day, right? So we are mechanics. We are scoping out what diseases there are, trying to troubleshoot what things are. We're putting, biologicals on, figuring out what pest problems we're scouting for, figuring out what the beneficials are. These are ladybird beetles here, just at different stages. So yeah, it's a lot that goes into the growing, figuring out how to plow. If you're a first generation soil farmer like myself, I had no idea how to plow. I had no idea how important tire spacing was on a tractor. And then again, not killing your crops when you're cultivating them. It's not as easy as it may sound. So yeah, I think farms of our scale are highly human focused. And we have really highly educated, thoughtful people who work for us. And we also need to find ways to keep them around. So HR is a huge component. And there's a lot of time dedicated to the HR side of things when you have a staff of 6, 10, 15. I think the biggest thing too is the financial obstacles. So, regenerative or biodiversity, like that, focused farms, at first glance, it doesn't make money. It takes money to reduce phosphorus levels. It takes money to plant cover crops. And sometimes they're only going to be grazed off by waterfowl. There's no benefit to the soil. It takes money, management, thought to be planting flowering strips for beneficial insects. So I think partnerships are really, really key. And like for us here in Delta, there's the Delta Farm and Wildlife Trust, who do cost share programs for cover cropping, grassland set-asides. And like for us, it's been imperative to have organizations like that. And I think as business owners, a lot is being thrown at us. There's a lot of energy and planning that goes into the day-to-day operations. And a lot of us sit on boards and volunteer our times other ways. So literally, I think we're always just trying to keep the farm afloat. So like yesterday, I was calling ICBC to renew tractor policy and having to explain to them that we can have a tractor policy, met with our crop consultant to go over soil tests, and then was budgeting out the fertilizer recommendations. I want to reduce our phosphorus. It's going to cost 4 times the amount of compost to move to granular. It's a hard sell. Then I have to email 50% of the emails that I got yesterday back, whether it's CSA inquiries, payment requests, emailing TransLink. They're doing work on the Westham Island Bridge, so figuring out the load limits that are going to come into place next week. Then I have a monthly meeting with a business coach to, this one was, more insight on working with the next generation, texting chefs on add-ons, checking on the tomato graphs, ordering seed, and then of course, like not forgetting to eat all the wonderful food that we grow. So, and then doing all the regular farming things that people typically think farmers do. So, anyways, I know I'm ranting a bit, but like that's what farmers are being faced on a day-to-day basis. And it's a lot, And I also have 2 kids and childcare scarce in Metro Vancouver. So like farmers are being challenged with a lot of things on a day-to-day basis. So when it comes to adding some of these things that kind of seem extra in a sense, there's a lot of obstacles. So yeah, after that bit of a rant there, I think for me, I think the help area is outreach. We need partners to help facilitate some of the changes that government wants. Both the federal and provincial governments are pushing for a green, regenerative agriculture agenda. We understand carbon targets need to be hit, and regeneratives is a really nice sounding word. But I think farmers are feeling a lot of pressure right now to be environmental stewards, to help move forward these mandates. But in turn, we're also being told to have low cost food. People can't afford food. Inflation is an issue. So I think farmers are feeling really pushed right now and are feeling guilty for asking for what the cost of the food is. So we're being put in a really hard place right now. We're being told to adapt, change. We understand the world is going to heck, reduce fuel, reduce fertilizer, use cover crops. But I don't think we necessarily have a practical suggestions on electric tractors yet. There's none on the marketplace that makes sense. There's not acknowledgement that we have like high yields are due to fertilizer and we need to keep people being fed. And in certain areas, cover crops actually take away soil moisture. On the prairies, it's really tough to grow cover crops when they decrease their grain crop, the crop that's paying the bills. So there's definitely a lot of obstacles and there's lots of nuances involved. So I know that's a bit of doom and gloom there on some of the things that farmers are faced, but like, yeah, of course there are benefits. You know, farmers, like, we love what we do. We love to raise our kids on the farm. We love to teach our staff about agriculture, and we love to feed like our customers nutrient dense food. Like, we want to meet these climate goals too. Like, we understand we need to adapt. You know, farmers have deep care for the world. Their hands are in the soil every day. But we need help. And, you know, having field days, showing what technology's out there, increasing fundings to organizations like Delta Farm and Wildlife Trust. But we really need that helping hand. It's, you know, we want to provide these ecological goods and services that are being asked of us, but there's a cost. And I feel like the burden is very much on the farmer, or there's money available, but it's here's the money, figure it out. And we don't have the management and the capacity to take on saving the world, which just seems like it's being asked of us right now, and making sure food is cheap so that people can afford it. So for me, I feel like I find it disrespectful, and that's for all scale of agriculture, but I'm finding that we're really being put in a really tough place right now. So that's Carly where I'm going to end it, not necessarily on the most positive note, but keeping it real, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lydia. I think that was a really good snapshot into farm life and how complex and demanding it is. So thanks for that. We love Croplearn Farm. I love Croplearn Farm. Very good Instagram follow, by the way. We will now turn it over to Kevin Norris. So between 2019 and 2022, Kevin was the acting director of the environment policy team within the strategic policy branch at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Since then, he's been the acting director of the Resilient Agriculture Policy Division, also within AFC. During this time, his teams have advanced several agri-environmental policies related to natural climate solutions, agricultural clean technologies, water, biodiversity adaptation, and increasing on-farm adoption of beneficial management practices, including as part of Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan and the new Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. That's a mouthful. I will now hand it over to Kevin to give an overview of the Sustainable Agriculture Strategy and some recent AAFC programming. Take it away, Kevin.
Perfect, and thank you, Carly. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invite, and thanks to Kenzo for the interesting presentation on his research, and Lydia for the overview of her operations and realities of farming, including those obstacles and challenges that you talked about, and the amazing pictures as well. And I definitely look forward to hearing from Kevin next as well. So. Just before moving to my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that since I am here in Ottawa, I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. So turning to slide 2, today I'm going to provide a bit of an higher level overview of the current and ongoing priorities of agriculture and agri-food Canada related to agri-environmental policies and programming. In particular, I am going to talk about the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. I'll also provide a bit of an overview on the Sustainable Agricultural Strategy, and I'll touch on some of the current programming available as well. On slide 3, as most of you are likely aware, having a shared jurisdiction for agriculture, federal, provincial, and territorial governments signed onto 5-year policy frameworks in Canada, which serve as the main vehicle to deliver program and policies to farmers in the sector. The current framework, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, provides $3 billion in support to strengthen the competitiveness, innovation, and resiliency of the agriculture, agri-food, and agri-based product sector. It's been in place since 2018 and ends at the end of this month, but FPT governments have been focused on developing and finalizing a new framework over the last year or so. And that goes as far back as November 2021, when FPT ministers of agriculture set the direction for the next framework under the Guelph Statement. Their vision is for Canada to be recognized as a world leader in sustainable agriculture and agri-food production. And at the time, they agreed on 5 priority areas for the framework. The first priority area under the framework is climate change and the environment. And this is a new focus from previous frameworks. And the fact that the level of ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and have meaningful positive impact is high. This also includes tackling climate change and environmental protection to support GHG emission reductions and the long-term vitality of the sector, while positioning producers and processors to seize economic opportunities from evolving consumer demands. And you'll see on the slide there that the other areas of focus are also listed. So with that in mind, on July 22nd of last year, FPT ministers announced a new Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership, and that is a 5-year agreement that will inject $500 million in new funding towards advancing the key priorities outlined in the Guelph Statement. And here on slide 4, you can see some of the important highlights from the new partnership. I won't go through them all, but I will highlight that the $500 million in new funds does represent an increase of 25% for cost shared activities. There's also a $250 million Resilient Agricultural Landscapes program, and this will be put in place to support ecological goods and services provided by the ag sector. And we're looking to improve our data collection and sharing and reporting on results, and a commitment also to contribute to measurable outcomes such as a 3 to 5 megaton reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and an increase for funded recipients that are Indigenous peoples and women and youth as well. So FPT governments are finalizing the details of the next agreement, and the jurisdictions are focused on designing the policies and programs, and hopefully be in place starting on April 1st, which is obviously just over a week or so. So we're pretty excited about that. So turning to the sustainable ag strategy on slide 5, in addition to the Sustainable Canadian Ag Partnership, the department is currently embarking on a development of this new strategy. Agriculture is facing a real triple challenge, which is producing healthy food for consumers at home and abroad, keeping our agricultural sector competitive, and ensuring that secure livelihoods of farmers as well, and doing this all in the environmentally sustainable manner. We know agriculture depends on a healthy and resilient environment to function well also. We also know that producers are in the direct line of climate change impacts, and that includes floods and droughts, changing rainfall patterns, heat waves, and more. This obviously has an impact on farmers in the form of loss of crops and livestock, a degradation of soil health, and incidence of pests and disease. So the strategy really is an opportunity to work together to tackle these challenges and set a path forward for the long-term sustainability and competitiveness of the sector. On slide 6, we also know that sustainability will be a key driver of the sector moving forward in the future, as there are increasing demands both at home and abroad for sustainable food and agricultural products. Consumers, especially the younger generations, are becoming increasingly savvy, looking to learn more about how and where their food comes from, and they're expecting sustainably produced food. And globally, we're also seeing an increased emphasis on sustainability and environmental stewardship from our trading competitors, many of whom are also developing their own sustainability frameworks for their agricultural sector. So our goal really for the new strategy will help to leverage the opportunities related to increased sustainability. On slide 7, we also want to outline some of the environmental successes of the sector already, and the strategy will build on those foundations achieved to date and initiatives currently in place that support improved sustainability. Also look to recognize the hard work and efforts of farmers to put into the sector in terms of advancing sustainable practices, and that includes turning agricultural soils, particularly in the prairies, and into significant carbon sinks, but also sequestering more carbon and through the adoption of tillage and no-till, conservation tillage, and no-till, and reduced summer fallow. There are also a number of different producer associations and agri-food companies that are making their own environmental commitments and working to make that happen in their respective commodities and parts of the value chains. And some of those are listed on the next slide, but I won't go through them in great detail. So maybe we'll move on to the slide 9. So the strategy is also going to build on existing government initiatives and programs in place to support producers in adopting on-farm practices and technology that do have environmental benefits. Many of you may know the programs that are currently in place that are listed here. This includes various programs, as I've talked about, that are delivered through by the province, but through the federal provincial Canadian Agricultural Partnership. But additionally, there are a number of federal-only programs also in place, and that includes the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, and this provides direct support to adopt practices in cover cropping, nitrogen management, and rotational grazing. And of note, one of the parties that we're working with through this fund is EcoCert Canada, and they help to certify organic farmers to help adopt ready to deploy BMPs that result in reduced GHG emissions through cover cropping and nitrogen management. We also have the Agricultural Clean Tech program, which provides support for clean technology adoption. In addition to these programs, there's an abundance of AFC science on the go. That includes the living labs where farmers and scientists work together in the field and on the farm to develop, test, and implement regional solutions. And there's also programs such as the AgriScience, and in particular under it, there's the Organic Science Cluster, which is looking to drive organic innovation. So on slide 10 here, we obviously know producers are a key part of the solution in advancing sustainability in the ag sector and are already great stewards of the land. So the approaches that we need to consider moving forward include the realities that producers and the nature of farming in Canada. We also need to take advantage of the solutions the sector can provide related to sequestering carbon and restoring wildlife habitat and generating renewable energy as well. On slide 11, when we're developing the sustainable ag strategy, we'll be consistently thinking of what the strategy needs to achieve. And here on the slide, we really want to highlight that we need to find the right balance between supporting an economically vibrant sector that contributes to the country's GDP and supports farmer livelihoods, but also one that supports a healthy environment while contributing to national commitments such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also the social responsibility of providing healthy food and supporting rural vitality. We also recognize that the strategy is also going to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to sustainability, and just given that diverse nature of production systems and regional conditions across the country. So moving on to slide 12, ultimately the sustainable ag strategy is intended to help share a shared direction for taking action to improve and address environmental issues in the sector while supporting farmer livelihoods and food production. It's going to look particularly at 5 priority areas or themes, and that includes adaptation and resilience, soil health, water quality and quantity, climate change mitigation, and biodiversity. It will aim to provide the overarching guidance to align current and future federal initiatives and programs related to agro-environmental issues. And this will serve as a bit of an umbrella strategy to bring together multiple climate environmental initiatives in the ag sector. And this includes the National Adaptation Strategy, work in response to the recently signed Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the Global Methane Pledge. We're also going to take a long look forward from here up to 2050. So in slide 13, as I mentioned, biodiversity is one of the main themes of the strategy. So I won't focus too much on this slide here, as I'm sure many of these points resonate well with everyone on this webinar today. But as a part of the sustainable ag strategy, we do want to hear from the sector and industry stakeholders and the public on several specific discussion issues. This includes some of the wording we have around a proposed vision for the strategy that points to Canada as a world leader in sustainable agriculture and agri-food production. It also builds on regional strengths and diversity, and also supports the sector in rising to the climate challenge, expanding to new markets, both here at home and abroad, while also feeding Canadians in a growing global population. We also want to hear about proposed goals and outcomes for the strategy, and this includes production that is more resilient to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture sector that are reducing or being reduced, and a sector that has increased capacity for carbon sequestration. We also want to hear about goals and outcomes related to biodiversity-rich landscapes and features there as well. And lastly, we do also want to hear about approaches to overcoming barriers and advancing agricultural or agri-environmental outcomes in the sector, and obviously the importance of data and how to improve the collection of data, but also the role of targets moving forward. So on 14 here, I do want to emphasize that the engagement of this throughout this process is central to the strategy. The strategy really aims to take an integrated and coordinated approach to advance sustainability in the sector, and recognizing that action in one area can have positive benefits in another. There will obviously be challenges, especially in finding that right balance between the economic, environment, and social considerations, and with data to monitor our progress to reach any environmental or climate goals for the sector. But by, I think, working collaboratively with stakeholders, province and territory partners, and Indigenous groups. The aim of the strategy is really to ensure that Canada's agriculture sector is equipped to recover quickly from extreme events, but also thrive in a changing climate and remain viable and competitive while protecting and preserving our natural resources for generations to come. As I've noticed, we're also developing the strategy with the sector, and this includes discussions through an advisory committee, and many of those groups are listed here. And it also, you can see, it represents a wide range of representatives from across the sector. So I'm going to end on just how you can get involved, and turning to the last slide. The primary way to get involved is to go online and provide comments via our online survey. This process does end soon. It's actually ending on March 31st. Regional outreach is ongoing, and this includes the last regional session online tomorrow. We've also held a number of workshops with farmers and sector stakeholders, provincial and territorial partners, and engagement with Indigenous groups is ongoing. Our end goal is to use all this information we have to produce a What We Heard report, and then ultimately release a draft sustainable agricultural strategy towards the end of the year. Well, the formal online consultation ends next week. I would obviously be happy to also receive any input from any of you on this webinar today directly, and I can pass it on to the leads in the department who are running this strategy for us. And I think the link was just provided there in the chat. So I will wrap up there, and then I'll pass it back to you, Carly. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I would definitely encourage everyone to contribute to the Sustainable Agriculture Strategy. They're accepting feedback from the public until March 31st, right? I believe. So that link is in the chat. So we will now move on to our final speaker, Kevin Cusson. Kevin is currently the product lead at Light Farm and has held an odd collection of roles throughout his career, from Peace Corps volunteer to software engineer, that rhymes, to founder and CEO of a West African biogas as a service company. So for the last 8 years, he's worked in various product management roles at a mix of private, public, and nonprofit entities, including leading roles on 2 open source projects, Open LMIS and Light Farm. Kevin has an MBA from the University of Washington and a bachelor's in computer science from the University of Texas at Dallas. And in his spare time, Kevin likes spending time with his family, reading about history and economic theory, and long distance backpacking trips. So today, Kevin will be touching on how technology can play a role in making research more relevant to diversified farmers, and how the industry and government can involve farmers in the development of tools so that they're actually useful for them. So thanks, Kevin, and take it away.
Thanks, Carly, and thanks to Kevin, Lydia, and Kenzo, as well as the other organizers, for putting together such a diverse set of perspectives on diversified agriculture. So today, I think I'm going to take you in a slightly different direction than many of the other speakers. I'd like to talk about how technology can play a role in making research more relevant, participative, and rewarding for diversified farmers, how industry and government can involve farmers in the development of tools so they're useful to them, as Carly mentioned, and then how good design can reduce barriers to technology adoption, and therefore allow agroecology and diversified agriculture to reach transformation at scale. And then the last thing, and this is kind of the main gist of my conversation, is around the value that farmers bring to the table, right? There's a lot of unique information that's stuck in farmers' heads all over the globe that as a scientific community, I think we tend to not fully take advantage of. So as mentioned, my name is Kevin Cusson. I have the honor of working with a fantastic open source community on the Light Farm product. Light Farm is a free and open source farm management tool built for current and aspiring sustainable farmers. And I will be the first to say that I don't come from an ag background. My background is building software, especially open source software. So when I came in and started building Light Farm, I noticed that there was a very different approach from a lot of tools that are built for farmers than I had seen in my past, right? It's more of an extractive model. How can we pull information out of farmers to be used elsewhere? So the strategy with Light Farm is a little bit different. First off, our number one focus is on usability and utility, right? So approachability, making it easy for someone to look at it and understand what's going on. So if we ever have a trade-off between, can we make this more powerful or can we make this easier to use? We're going to always err on the side of easier to use. And here's an example. When I took over the project, the screen on the left was the first thing you saw. It required that someone enter in 5 pieces of information. And I said, we can simplify that. Instead, enter in 1 piece of information, click a button that generates your current location, and then we're off to the races, right? The units of measure, the currency, those can largely be assumed based on what the individual chooses. Second, and I think both Kenzo and Lydia spoke to this, is we got to help farmers make a living, right? It's a difficult business. I'm continually impressed with the number of things a farmer has to be good at in order to be a good farmer. It's almost unending, right? So farmers want to do the right thing. They're the stewards of the land. You know, it's their life, but we need to make it easy. We need to make it sustainable financially in order to make it sustainable environmentally. And then lastly, the third prong of our strategy is to connect farmers with the expert knowledge and tools to improve their practice. LightFarm is not the most advanced tool in the world. It is supposed to be the most accessible tool for farmers so that we can connect you to the greenhouse gas calculators or the other tools that can show you 25 different data layers on your farm map. Okay. So I want to start with this screen. This is a screen that we built recently. And for those that have used agricultural software, typically it's really dense. There's a lot of required things. There's fairly advanced metrics like I need to know this thing in grams per meter cubed, right? It can be very difficult to look at and even know what you're entering. So when it comes to LightFarm, on this screen, we can see there's 1 required field. Everything else is optional. So it essentially, we're doing our best to meet farmers where they're at. Like, what information do you know about this? And if you don't, that's fine. You know, you can still use the application. And then the biggest thing I want to point out is this piece down at the bottom, the nominate this crop for inclusion in the LightFarm crop catalog. So LightFarm by default has about 400 different crops that you can select with, and each of those have about 50 data points behind them. But a big thing that we're trying to do is to include farmers as part of the research to make it a little bit more participative, right? And then secondarily, we're also trying to educate, right? If you have the time and the inclination and you don't know what a varietal versus a cultivar is, we've got these little links here that go to the LightFarm website where you can read a 6-paragraph thing explaining the nuance between the two, right? Essentially meeting users where they are to present new information, but only if they want it. So what does this get us? Here on the right, you can see just a quick screenshot from our database. Over the last several years, farmers all over the world have added 1,700 different varietals of cultivated crops, right? We started with 400. By allowing farmers to add the crops that they're growing in their environment, we now have a database that is significantly larger. By default, you don't see these when you log on, but through this nomination process, we can put that in front of an agronomist in that region, and it can be promoted to the global data set so that any other farmer that's growing in that region also now has access to this as a template for a crop that they're growing, right? So this is kind of a general pattern that we use throughout LightFarm. Another implementation of this pattern is around the things that happen on a farm, right? If I want to create a task, I want to assign it to someone on a farm, LightFarm comes with 9 default tasks, right? You've got your cleaning task, your field work, your harvest, your transplant. But we also have this really easy and approachable way to customize a task. I want to do something else. I want to prune. I want to, move livestock, whatever. And through the same method, by allowing farmers to say, I need to customize this to the practices that I'm doing, we learn from that user. Over the years, we've collected over 400 different management practices that farmers have said, this is useful on my farm, I'm going to add it, and then we can analyze that, right? So this has two benefits. On the scientific research side, we're learning about these new practices. If there was a research team that was looking into a particular practice, and they were part of our behavioral ethics approval, they could reach out to those farmers and say, hey, we'd like to learn more about this, right? And kind of ask them if they'd like to opt in. From a software development perspective, this is our users telling us what we should be doing, right? They're customizing this. They're doing a lightweight version of it. And that tells us that if we can build this in a more robust way, that users will use it. And that's a rare thing in software that you're explicitly told this is exactly what you should do. And just a third example is when farmers are onboarding with Lightfarm, we ask them, are you interested in getting any type of certification? We support 2 different types right now, organic and participant guarantee system. But we also have this option to propose something else, right? So we can ask the farmer, well, what should we be focusing on? And here you can see on the right a quick query that I ran that said, by country, what are the other certifications that are interesting to our users? So you can see there's a cluster of certified naturally grown, and then a global gap down here. But we also have about 2,500 other submissions for various certifications or certifiers that farmers want to work with. The last thing I want to focus on is just making it participatory. We're an open source project. We've got about 10 staff. We've got about 100 people that are volunteering with the project, from farmers that are meeting in a group once a month to help us build the right things, to contributors that are software engineers that are writing code because this is something important to them, to designers that are contributing their time, to scientists that are helping us build the right things from a scientific perspective. It's a truly kind of global good environment and community right now. On the left, you can see we publish a roadmap that says these are the things we're considering building. And then on the right, you can see that users actually have the ability to go to this website. They can upvote or downvote, and they can tell us how we should be doing it. So you can just see a handful of comments here around how people would like us to implement things. Of course, a big piece of this is trust, right? Like, we are a non-commercial entity. We're not selling this data to anyone. Farmers retain the right and the ownership of their data. So if a farmer comes to us and says, I tried out Lightfarm, I don't like it, delete my farm, delete my data, we do it, right? We're not selling it to anyone. It's only available behind a research ethics approval for other scientists that are looking at related areas where the Lightfarm data set could be useful. We publish the application in 4 human translated versions. We have access to all of our documents, including the data policy on our GitHub page in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And I think that that's a big part of the trust. So the big question, if I were in your shoes, might be, has this been successful? Well, the project started in early 2018. I joined in 2020. I hired kind of the first full-time staff. And since then, we have grown to have a presence on 6 continents, 140 different countries. 3,000 farms are running their operations on Lightfarm, and we have about 3,500 different users as well. So you can see there's big clusters, obviously, in British Columbia, because we started at UBC, but Latin America, the US, other parts of Canada. I would say it's been fairly successful. And we just have a fantastic team. You know, this is from a call I did this morning, where we're kicking off the next, portion, the scope of what we're building in the near term. And this is the team. And about half of those people are joining because they think that Lightfarm is a meaningful thing. They think that our food systems growing in a way that we can feed people and we can sustain the planet is an important thing to contribute their time to. So this is not everyone. We have about 100 people in about a dozen countries. So there's never going to be a call where everyone can join. But this was this morning, and there were 4 continents represented, maybe a dozen languages. And that's one silver lining to a lot of the challenges that we're facing right now, is that they bring together a really amazing group, just like the speakers today, to try to address them. So again, my name is Kevin Cusson. I also work with Hannah Whitman at UBC. If Light Farm is interesting to you for whatever reason, please reach out. We'd be happy to collaborate.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. It's really exciting to see everything that's changed with Light Farm since 2018. So cool. So it's now time to move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we'll be asking our panelists some curated questions as well as any live audience questions we receive. So just a reminder to navigate to the Zoom control panel and select Q&A to input your questions. And you can also upvote other folks' questions. So I think maybe we'll open it up with just a general question for all the panelists. So one of our questions is, what role do you believe land rights, so for instance, ownership versus rental of ag lands, play in shaping management decisions? So are there policies which could make a difference, like increasing land tenure periods to encourage long-term management plans?
I mean, I can get started a little bit just because I referenced it. I mean, when talking to farmers, it became very clear that land tenure is a huge consideration in the level of investment that folks are willing to put in, or resources they're willing to invest long-term in restoring their soils or building their soils in the local ecosystem. Here in California, we have a few interesting projects that are really trying to tackle this land access problem, where land is just really limited. Part of that is trying to work with retiring farmers and really like partnering them and facilitating a process of transferring land ownership from one entity to particularly trying to find ways of finding new beginning farmers and also Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are trying to get into farming and facilitating that process. I think there's also some active work going into trying to do outreach to folks who do own land but are not necessarily the operators, to then have conversations with their tenant farmers about the benefits of investing long-term in their land and why it might be beneficial for them as the landowner to have longer-term contracts with their farmers, such that they can be increasing the value of their land through those regenerative practices. And so there are a few different angles that we're thinking about it in terms of just facilitating those types of transfer processes. There's also discussions of like land trusts and kind of the role that that might play, which is a little bit complex. But yeah, the land tenure problem is definitely one that we're thinking a lot about in California and probably beyond.
Yeah, thanks, Kenzo. I don't know if any other panelists have thoughts on that question as well. Feel free.
I don't mind jumping in, Carly, but to be honest, it's probably not a place for the federal government to get involved, because here in Canada, it's more of a PT sort of jurisdiction around land and natural resource management. But just to say that I think from the federal government perspective that, you know, we support all production practices and size of operation regardless of land ownership. So our role really is to support environmental sustainability. And this happens, as I mentioned, through cost share programming and federal programming and our science and innovation.
Yeah, I can jump in really quick. I think, yeah, I think it's a huge issue. I sit on a young farmer peer mentorship group. So there's farmers from Saskatchewan, and land is just being bought up, and, you know, they can't, you know, they are really struggling to get rentals now. The rent's gone up incredibly, and it just doesn't make sense for them to go and invest putting hedgerows in or doing these things. Like, it just, like, things are so tight as it is, it doesn't make sense. So it doesn't matter where it is across Canada. So whether, I don't know if there's incentives for landowners, if they're going to be doing some of these things. I don't necessarily love tax breaks for people that are investing in land only to flip it 10 years later. But if it will not it will never make sense for the actual farmer who is renting, leasing the land to be doing it. So there needs to be other ways from other levels of government to provide incentive for the landowners to be doing some of that stuff, because for farmers that only have that for one season, you're barely going to do your fertilizer, what your crop actually needs, let alone all the the cover cropping or hedgerows or all the other lovely things.
Yeah, I don't have hard data on that, but I've had that same conversation maybe half a dozen times. So I just agree with Lydia and Kenzo.
So there's a question in the Q&A. How much wetland is the Agri-Canada plan aiming to restore or add each year? A bit of a change of topic, but.
I can jump in. There's actually no firm target on how much wetland we're looking to add through any of our funding. But I'll point out that the new Resilient Ag landscape program, which I talked about, will look to provide funding in that cost shared format again with our PT partners to support the preservation or maintain wetlands on farm. And there's also funding available through Environment Canada's Nature Smart Climate Fund for also supporting and restoring wetland ecosystems as well.
Awesome, thanks, Kevin. So moving to a couple questions specifically about Light Farm. So the first question is, how does language work in Light Farm? Does all the information get automatically translated for people using the app in different countries?
Yeah, great question. I'll try not to get too deep into technology. The short answer is we human translate 4 languages: English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, just so that you get the best context. And then everything else is translated to the language of the observer based on the browser location and the browser specifications. And that's done with machine learning. So it works okay in most cases. We have a lot of users in countries that we do not do human translations, India, Vietnam, even countries without or not using the Latin alphabet. So that's the strategy.
Cool, thanks, Kevin. So another Light Farm question. Who owns the software of Light Farm? What are the costs to the farmer other than data entry time? Is it a subscription? Are there any technical limitations? What would be the optimum sized farm for the system? Okay, so quite a few.
Whoa, there's a lot of questions. The first one, who owns it? We all own it. We're all co-owners. So it's released under the GPL license, which says that anyone can take it and modify it. You just have to attribute back that you are using it, and that you can even take it and commercialize it if you want. We won't, but that's a possibility. What was the second question, Carly?
The second question was, what are the costs to the farmer other than data entry time? Is it a subscription?
Yeah, it's so no, it's not a subscription. It's software as a service. So it's a web application. You go to lightfarm.org, you click register at the top right, and you're absolutely right. Data entry is a cost. So you do have to set it up. You would have to use it on a regular basis. But our purpose is to try to make it so that you get value out of the time that you put in, right? So if you add your crop plans in there and then you document harvests, those harvests will feed into like your metrics around how much you captured. If you put in your sales and expenses, then you'll get crop by crop profitability. You also get farm-wide profitability. And then you'll also be able to generate documentation for certification. So the hope is that we've made it valuable enough to offset the time that you spend putting things in. Otherwise, there's no costs.
Okay, cool. So the last 2 questions are there any technical limitations, and what would be the optimal size for the system?
Yeah, okay, technical limitations. The biggest one we have right now is you have to have an internet connection. So we're endeavoring to make many portions of the application accessible on your device without a connection. So say you're in your house and you have Wi-Fi, and then you walk out into the field and you don't. and the cell signal is poor, for example, we would like to make it so that a lot of the information is cached on the app so that you can do what you need to do. And then when you get back in Wi-Fi, it'll resolve any conflicts in the data. That isn't completely built out yet. We're just kind of putting our feet in the water on that one at this point in time. Otherwise, we've designed it for accessibility. We've designed it for mobile first, so that farmers that don't have a computer but do have a smartphone can use it. It can be used on $50 smartphones, and it can be used on poor connections, but things get a little bit messy if it's a really bad internet connection. And then, sorry, Carly, what was the last one?
Optimal size for light farm size.
I don't know if I can answer that. I've done some analysis, and the median size is about 3.3 hectares, growing 20 to 30 different crops. But we also have people that are market gardeners. We have people that are growing in their backyard that are using it on 25 square meters, all the way up to 10,000 hectare coffee farms in Uganda. Right, so it's a big kind of, there's a lot of diversity in the farms that use light farm. I would say in general, if you are doing monocropping, there's probably better software that integrates with your machinery. So the niche that light farm was designed for is the diversified farmer that wasn't being met by some of the other ag tech solutions out there.
Okay, very cool, very helpful. Thanks, Kevin. So maybe we'll move to a more general question for all the panelists. So what are some of the best ways for the general public to support diversification?
I can, I don't pay a lot for food, I grow it. So this is going to be easy for this is coming from that perspective, but paying the value of what food is. And anyways, I want to acknowledge that, what rent is, what childcare is, all the other pressures, but what that level of disposable income is, that daily coffee or the twice annual trip to Mexico, I personally would question that. I think there might be more value to put it towards, good food, and good food done right costs money. And it's not that you can't find it in the grocery store, because I think we need to acknowledge too that there will always be larger scale farms, and they're really important. They produce most of the food and do it much more efficiently. So, I don't want to say go to the farmer's market, know your farmer, because that's not necessarily practical for everyone. I think that definitely works. But I hesitate to say, hey, it'd be great to have labeling, this is a regenerative lettuce coming from the Salinas Valley. I don't know what is actually practical. I mean, this is why it's tough stuff. But I think people paying the value of what the food actually is. I think there's so many hidden costs associated that people don't see. So education, awareness, I guess is a bit of a step there.
Yeah, so maybe if you have the access and you can be informed about the products that you're buying and who you're supporting in that process, to be intentional about it, and to do so and put your efforts there with whatever purchasing power we have. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that question? Yeah.
So I mean, we're an open source project. We have a lot of volunteers with very, very diverse skill sets. So if you're interested in diversified agriculture and you have an interesting skill set, whatever that is, get involved in a community of some sort, right? Like, we have scientists that are contributors, we have lawyers that are contributors. If someone comes to me and they say, Kevin, I like what you guys are doing with Light Farm, how can I help? I'm going to sit down with you, no matter what your skill set is. because I want you to get in, and even if today there's not something that you can help with, like maybe 3 months from now there is. So I would say go out and get involved in organizations or communities that support sustainable and diversified agriculture.
So send Kevin an email for specifics.
Outreach@lightfarm.org.
Yeah, just a quick add-on. I mean, I think Lydia nailed it, and I wanted it to come from her first, but like everything we heard from farmers was just that having those diverse market streams and consumers who are willing to, eaters, I don't know, I'd struggle with the word consumer sometimes, but folks who are willing to pay the price of what it costs and pay that premium enabled really in our sample size or set those farmers to adopt and experiment. And I think that there are also a lot of things at the kind of local policy level that can support these types of things that can also feed into kind of national policies. I know in the US, we have a program that started as a local initiative in California and then spread to the federal level of doubling the credits that you get if you're on what we call SNAP here, Supplemental Nutrient Assistance Program, which helps folks who need assistance in getting groceries double the kind of money amount that they're able to use when purchasing at farmers markets. And I think there are cool and innovative folks at all levels kind of proposing this type of more like local food economy type things that can help make it such that that cost barrier also doesn't become an equity and food access issue. And so also just encouraging folks to think about kind of ways and organizations that are getting creative in this way, because I think there are so many different ways to engage. And I think policy is one that can feel intimidating, but there are so many cool and active communities thinking about how we can leverage just like curiosity and imaginations in how alternative food economies can exist and how that can start at a fairly local level, but then again, be a model to be then expanded and provide kind of additional policy support and structure for at larger levels. And I imagine that likely exists in the Canadian context as well.
I'll just jump in and say I think those are all great answers. And just from our perspective, like all major federal government initiatives have a consultation process. So get involved, get engaged in those. And I'll put a plug out again for the sustainable ag strategy, and definitely send us your thoughts on diversification in ag and as part of that process.
Yeah, those are all really great answers. Lydia, I kind of have a question for you related to this, but more specific to your farm and whether you kind of have opportunities for like volunteers or I don't know if you asking for a friend, you know?
No, we do not take on volunteers. I mean, that was your question, Carly. Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, like it's highly skilled. There's a lot of tasks. A lot of people get trained on things. It's like retention's like key for us, you know, year after year type thing. So, yeah, it's gonna sound harsh, but we're not in, you know, we want to educate our staff and teach our staff, but to have people kind of, you know, one-off and things like that, you also have to pay workers' comp for volunteers and things like that. It gets murky on the legal side of things. So no, for us, we don't ever take volunteers. We've always got lots to do and things like that. We have, you know, we have open houses and things like that people can learn about the farm. But yeah, don't do any volunteer opportunities.
It's fine. It's fine. Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left until we wrap up. I don't think there are any more Q&A questions. And I feel like starting a new question might bring us to overtime. So I think we'll wrap up. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for sharing your time with us and helping to move our food system forward. So we'll send a follow-up email where you can send us any further questions, or you can reach out to our panelists directly, and we'll provide some emails, I believe. So thanks so much to our presenters and panelists, Kenzo, Lydia, Kevin Norris, and Kevin Cusson. So behind the scenes, we'd also like to thank Jenna Melanson, Akila Varghese, and Julie McHow. Thanks for, you can join us for our first in-person event in the speaker series. It's called Feeding the City, Tackling Food Insecurity in Vancouver. That's on Thursday, April 20th at the Global Lounge. So let us know what you thought about the webinar. You'll be directed to a short survey about the session after the webinar, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. Also, feel free to visit us at ubcfarm.ubc.ca. Thanks for joining. We look forward to continuing this discussion. And I believe there was a slide with some emails and information. I don't know if you're able to share that, Juliana, just before everyone leaves. There it is. Awesome. Cool. So there are the emails in case you want to get in touch with any of the panelists or me for fun. So thanks, everyone, and have a lovely Thursday afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.